Welcome to Drowseworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Salem witch trials, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how a simple argument with your neighbor could get you hanged. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Maybe turn the lights down, put a fan on for that gentle hum, and settle in as we journey back to 1692. It's January 1692, and you live in Salem Village, Massachusetts. The winter is brutal, the kind that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. Your small wooden house offers little protection from the wind that howls through the cracks in the walls. You wake before dawn, as you always do, because there's work to be done and daylight is precious. The fire has died overnight, and the room is so cold you can see your breath forming small clouds in the darkness. You're a farmer, like most people in Salem Village. Your life revolves around the seasons, the soil, and the stern dictates of Puritan faith. Every Sunday, and often on Thursday lecture days, you sit through hours of sermons in the unheated meeting house, listening to Reverend Samuel Perris preach about sin, damnation, and the ever-present threat of Satan's influence in your community. The hard wooden benches make your back ache, but you dare not shift too much or show discomfort. Such behavior might be noted, and in Salem, being noted is dangerous. Your days begin in darkness and often end in darkness. You tend to your small plot of land, growing corn, beans, and squash, the staples that will see you through another harsh New England winter. You might have a cow, perhaps some chickens, a pig if you're fortunate. The animals need constant care, feeding, milking, mucking out their shelters. Your hands are perpetually rough, cracked from cold and labor. In the winter months, when the ground is frozen solid, you repair tools, mend fences, chop endless cords of wood. The social structure of Salem Village is rigid and unforgiving. At the top are the wealthy merchants and landowners, men like the Putnam family, who own vast tracts of land and wield considerable influence. Then come the middling farmers like yourself, respectable but hardly comfortable. Below you are the landless laborers, the servants, the truly poor, and hovering over everyone is the watchful eye of the church, the magistrates, the community itself, always ready to judge, to condemn, to enforce conformity. But Salem Village in early 1692 is a community already fracturing under enormous pressure. There are bitter disputes about land boundaries, arguments about who should be the minister, resentments over wealth and status. The village is locked in a seemingly endless conflict with Salem Town, the more prosperous coastal settlement from which Salem Village is trying to separate. Families are divided. Neighbors eye each other with suspicion. It's a pressure cooker of resentment, fear, and religious fervor, and it's about to explode. In late January, something strange begins happening in the household of Reverend Perris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, start having fits. They scream, contort their bodies in impossible ways, speak in strange voices, complain of being pinched and pricked by invisible hands. The local doctor, William Griggs, examines them and finds no physical cause. He utters the words that will doom Salem Village. The girls are bewitched. You hear about this at the meeting house, in hushed conversations at the general store, from neighbors who stop by your property. At first, you're skeptical. Witchcraft seems like something from the old country, from distant places. But then more girls start showing symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Mary Warren, Elizabeth Booth, Susanna Sheldon, all of them having fits, all of them claiming to be tormented by spectres, by the invisible shapes of witches who pinch them, choke them, tempt them to sign the devil's book. The afflicted girls begin naming names. First, they accuse Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved woman from Barbados. Then Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who goes door to door asking for food and lodging. Then Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who hasn't attended church regularly and who is involved in a scandalous legal dispute over her late husband's estate. These are society's outsiders, easy targets, women who have already violated Puritan norms in various ways. You might think you're safe. You're a respectable farmer, a church member in good standing. You attend services, you pray, you work hard. But this is where you're wrong. Because in Salem, in 1692, no one is safe. The accusations spread like wildfire, and the criteria for being accused are terrifyingly arbitrary. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the Salem witch trials. Maybe you had an argument with one of the Putnam family members over a property boundary. That dispute you thought was settled. It's about to become evidence of your malicious nature. Perhaps you muttered something under your breath when a neighbor refused to lend you a tool, and the next week, that neighbor's cow died. Coincidence? Not in Salem. That's maleficium, harmful magic, and you're the obvious culprit. Or perhaps you're simply too prosperous. You have better land than your neighbors. Your crops do well when others fail. You've managed to save a bit of money. In a community governed by the Puritan work ethic, success should be a sign of God's favor. But when accusations are flying, success can look suspicious. How did you get so fortunate? Perhaps you made a pact with the devil. Perhaps that's why your crops flourish while others struggle. Or maybe you're not prosperous enough. If you're poor, if you depend on the charity of others, if you go door to door asking for food or shelter, you're vulnerable. Sarah Good was accused, partly because she was a beggar who muttered to herself when people turned her away. Those mutters were interpreted as curses. If you're dependent on others' goodwill and you show any resentment when that goodwill is withheld, you're a witch. Perhaps you're simply odd. You prefer solitude. You have knowledge of herbal remedies and healing, skills that in better times make you valuable to the community but in times of panic make you suspect. You have a birthmark or a mole that could be interpreted as a witch's mark, the spot where your familiar, your demonic servant, suckles. You own a cat. You mutter to yourself while you work. You have vivid dreams and you made the mistake of telling someone about them. Any of these things can doom you. The accusations follow a pattern that ensures almost anyone can be targeted. The afflicted girls, during their fits, claim to see spectres, the ghostly shapes of the witches tormenting them. This spectral evidence becomes the primary form of proof in the trials. You could be sitting in church, visible to everyone, while the girls claim your spectre is across the room pinching them, choking them, trying to force them to sign the devil's book. You have no defense against this. How do you prove you didn't send your spectre to torment someone? How do you demonstrate that your invisible, immaterial form wasn't somewhere else doing evil? When you're accused, and you will be accused because the accusations spread exponentially, you're arrested and taken to jail. The jail in Salem is a nightmare. It's cold, damp, filthy. Prisoners are kept in chains, often in complete darkness. You're not given adequate food or water. The jailer charges you for your accommodations, for your chains, for every miserable moment you spend in that hole. If you survive the trial and are found innocent, you still have to pay your jail fees before you can be released. If you can't pay, you remain imprisoned. While you're in jail, your family suffers. Your farm goes untended. Your animals die or are seized to pay your jail fees. Your children might be taken in by neighbors, or they might starve. Your spouse might also be accused. Many families were destroyed entirely, with parents and children all arrested, all charged with witchcraft. Then comes your examination, the preliminary hearing before the magistrates. This is not like a modern trial. There is no presumption of innocence. The magistrates, John Hathon and Jonathan Corwin, assume you're guilty and conduct the examination accordingly. Their job is not to determine if you're guilty, but to extract a confession. You're brought before them, and the afflicted girls are present. As soon as you enter the room, the girls begin having fits. They scream, they fall to the ground. They claim you're tormenting them right now, at this very moment. If you look at them, they scream that your gaze is attacking them. If you clench your hands, they claim you're pinching them. If you bite your lip, they cry out that they're being bitten. Every movement you make, every expression that crosses your face is used as evidence of your witchcraft. The magistrates ask you leading questions. Why do you torment these girls? Not did you, but why? When did you sign the devil's book? Who else is involved in your conspiracy? If you deny the charges, you're lying and showing a hardened heart. If you seem calm, you're unnaturally composed, which suggests demonic assistance. If you show emotion, you're displaying the instability associated with witchcraft. There is no right answer. Every response damns you further. They might perform physical examinations, looking for witches, marks, any unusual blemish, scar, or mole on your body. You're stripped and examined intimately, humiliatingly, by people appointed by the court. Any imperfection is noted as potential evidence. They might perform the touch test. If the afflicted girls stop having fits when you touch them, it's believed your magical energy flows back into you, proving you're the source of their torment. If you confess, you might live. This is the terrible paradox of Salem. Those who confess to witchcraft, who admit to signing the devil's book, who name other witches in elaborate and fantastical stories, are generally not executed. They're valuable. They provide the names that keep the trials going. They validate the entire enterprise. Tituba confessed and survived. Dozens of others who confessed also survived. But if you maintain your innocence, if you refuse to confess to something you didn't do, you're likely to hang. This is what happens to Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman of impeccable reputation, a church member beloved by many. She refuses to confess to witchcraft because she hasn't done it. Her integrity costs her her life. She's hanged on July 19, 1692, along with 4 other women who also refuse to confess to lies. The trials move quickly through the spring and summer of 1692. A special court of Oya and Termina is established to handle the cases. The judges include some of the most prominent men in Massachusetts: Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, Samuel Sewell, William Sargent. They accept spectral evidence. They accept the testimony of the afflicted girls without question. They create an environment where conviction is almost inevitable. Between June and September 1692, the court conducts trials constantly. 19 people are hanged, 14 women and 5 men. They're taken to Gallows Hill, a rocky outcropping near Salem town. There's no proper gallows, just a large tree. They're forced to climb a ladder with the noose already around their necks, and then the ladder is pulled away. It's not a clean death. The drop isn't far enough to break the neck, so they strangle slowly, their bodies convulsing, their faces turning purple, while crowds watch. One man, Giles Corey, refuses to enter a plea, which means he can't be tried. The court decides to press him, an ancient form of torture designed to force a plea. He's stripped naked, a board is placed on his chest, and heavy stones are piled on top, crushing him slowly. The process takes 2 days. Each time they ask if he'll enter a plea, he responds, "More weight." He dies without pleading, which means his property can't be seized by the court. It can pass to his heirs. His final act is one of defiance and protection of his family. At least 5 people die in jail, including Sarah Osborne and an infant born to one of the accused women. Dozens more are imprisoned for months. The exact number of accusations is hard to determine, but historians estimate that between 150 and 200 people were accused. The panic spreads beyond Salem village to surrounding communities, to Andover, to Ipswich, even reaching into Maine. What makes Salem particularly terrifying is how quickly normal community relations dissolve into accusation and counter-accusation. Neighbors who lived peacefully for years suddenly testify against each other, dredging up old grievances, old arguments, old resentments. A woman who argued about a property line 20 years ago suddenly remembers that afterward her child got sick. A man recalls that after refusing to lend his neighbor a horse, his barn caught fire. Memories are reconstructed, reinterpreted through the lens of witchcraft, and perfectly normal conflicts become evidence of demonic conspiracy. The Putnam family is heavily involved in the accusations. Anne Putnam Sr. and her daughter Anne Putnam Jr. are responsible for many accusations. Thomas Putnam, the patriarch, files numerous complaints. The Putnams have ongoing disputes with many families in Salem village. Disputes about land, about politics, about the church. The witch trials become a way to settle these scores, to destroy enemies under the cover of religious righteousness. Your best hope for survival is to confess immediately, provide elaborate details about your supposed witchcraft, and name others. If you do this, you'll likely live, though you'll spend months in jail, lose your property, and carry the stigma forever. But you'll live, if you maintain your innocence. If you refuse to participate in the lie, you'll probably hang. The system is designed to perpetuate itself, each confession leading to more accusations, more arrests, more trials. By September 1692, the trials are spinning out of control. Some of the afflicted girls have begun accusing the wives of prominent ministers, wealthy merchants, even the wife of Governor Phipps. When the accusations start reaching the upper levels of society, doubts begin to surface. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in Massachusetts, publishes a treatise questioning the use of spectral evidence. He argues that the devil can assume the shape of an innocent person, which means spectral evidence proves nothing. Governor Phipps returned from fighting in Maine and alarmed to find his own wife accused, dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. A new court is established with stricter standards for evidence. Spectral evidence is no longer accepted. Of the 56 cases this court hears, it acquits 49. The 3 people it does convict are immediately pardoned by Governor Phipps. But the damage is done. 19 people are dead. Families are destroyed. The community is traumatized. And you, if you survived, are left to pick up the pieces of your shattered life. Your property might be gone, seized to pay jail fees. Your reputation is ruined. Your neighbors look at you with suspicion or shame. The social fabric of Salem village is torn beyond repair. In the aftermath, there are some attempts at reconciliation. In 1697, a day of fasting and soul-searching is declared. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, publicly confesses error and asks for forgiveness. Anne Putnam Jr., in 1706, makes a public apology. claiming she was deluded by Satan. In 1711, the colonial legislature passes a bill restoring the rights and good names of those accused and provides some financial restitution to their heirs. But these gestures can't undo the horror. They can't bring back the dead, can't restore the years lost to imprisonment, can't heal the psychological trauma. Salem becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, of religious extremism, of allowing fear and suspicion to override reason and justice. You wouldn't survive the Salem witch trials because the game was rigged from the start. The accusations were unfalsifiable. The evidence was invisible. The system rewarded lying and punished integrity. Your neighbors, people you'd known your entire life, would testify against you to save themselves or settle old grudges. And the authorities, who should have protected you, instead fed the panic, accepting the wildest accusations and the flimsiest evidence. Salem teaches us that civilization is fragile, that communities can turn on themselves with shocking speed, that fear, combined with religious certainty and social tension, can create conditions where innocent people are murdered with the full sanction of the law. And it reminds us that the most dangerous accusation is the one that can't be disproven, the invisible crime, the spectral evidence that exists only in the minds of the accusers. As you drift off to sleep tonight, safe in your bed, consider how lucky you are to live in a time and place where accusations require evidence, where trials have standards, where innocence is presumed rather than guilt. The people of Salem had no such protections. They lived in a world where a neighbor's spite, a magistrate's seal, and a group of afflicted girls could send you to the gallows for a crime that didn't exist. The tragedy of Rebecca Nurse, a life of virtue destroyed. In the spring of 1692, as accusations of witchcraft tore through Salem village like a plague, one arrest shocked the community more than any other. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman known throughout the area for her piety, her kindness, and her unwavering faith, was accused of witchcraft. Her story illustrates the arbitrary cruelty of the Salem trials and demonstrates that no amount of virtue, no lifetime of good deeds could protect you once the accusations began. Rebecca was born Rebecca Town in 1621 in Great Yarmouth, England. She came to Massachusetts as a child with her parents and siblings, part of the Great Puritan migration seeking religious freedom in the New World. In 1645, she married Francis Nurse, a man who would prove to be a devoted husband through more than 4 decades of marriage. Together, they raised 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters, on a farm in Salem village. By all accounts, it was a loving family, hard-working, devout, respected. Francis Nurse was a skilled craftsman and a successful farmer. Through decades of labor, he managed to acquire a substantial property, a 300-acre farm that he leased from the town family. The Nurse homestead was one of the more prosperous in Salem village, with a sturdy house, productive fields, orchards, and livestock. But prosperity, as we've discussed, could be dangerous in Salem. Success bred resentment, especially when that success seemed to mock the struggles of less fortunate neighbors. Rebecca Nurse was known for her deep faith and her charitable nature. Despite her own large family, she found time to help neighbors in need. She served as a midwife, attending births throughout the community. She nursed the sick, providing herbal remedies and comfort. She was a faithful member of Salem Village Church, attending services regularly even as age and infirmity made the journey increasingly difficult. Her reputation for piety was so strong that when she was first accused, many people simply couldn't believe it. But Rebecca had enemies, though she likely didn't realize how dangerous those enemies were. The Nurse family was on the wrong side of several community disputes. When Salem Village was trying to establish its independence from Salem Town, The nurses sided with those who opposed separation. When disputes arose about who should be the minister, the nurses opposed the faction that supported Reverend Samuel Peris. These weren't personal vendettas, they were disagreements about community governance. But in the poisonous atmosphere of 1692, old disagreements became evidence of malicious intent. The Putnam family, the most powerful clan in Salem village and the primary drivers of the witch hunt, had particular reason to resent the nurses. There were old property disputes between the families. The nurses' success contrasted sharply with the Putnams' recent struggles. Several Putnam family members had died in recent years, losses they attributed to witchcraft rather than disease or misfortune, and the Putnams were fervent supporters of Reverend Peris, while the nurses were among his critics. On March 23, 1692, Edward Putnam and Jonathan Walcott filed a formal complaint against Rebecca Nurse, accusing her of committing acts of witchcraft against Ann Putnam Jr., Abigail Williams, and others. The next day, a warrant was issued for her arrest. When the constable arrived at the Nurse homestead to take Rebecca into custody, her family was devastated. This was a woman who had lived 71 years without a blemish on her character, who had devoted her life to family, faith, and community. How could she be accused of making a pact with the devil? Rebecca was partially deaf and in poor health. The journey to Salem village for her examination was difficult. On March 24th, she was brought before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin in the packed meeting house. The afflicted girls were present, as always, ready to perform their fits. The examination transcript that survives shows the impossible position Rebecca was in from the moment the questioning began. Magistrate Hathorne's first question set the tone. What do you say to them? Here are those that accuse you of witchcraft. Rebecca, confused and frightened, asked what she could say. She was accused. She knew she was innocent, but how could she prove it? The magistrates demanded she explain why the girls were afflicted. Rebecca responded sensibly that she couldn't tell. She didn't know why they were having fits. She had nothing to do with it. But sensible answers weren't acceptable. Hathorne pressed her. Why? It is you or your appearance. This was the terrible logic of spectral evidence. Either Rebecca herself was tormenting the girls, or her spectre was doing it without her knowledge, which still implicated her because the devil supposedly couldn't use someone's shape without their permission. There was no escape from this reasoning. Throughout the examination, the afflicted girls shrieked and convulsed. Every time Rebecca moved, they claimed she was attacking them. When she clasped her hands, they screamed that she was pinching them. When she leaned on the rail in front of her for support, her age and infirmity making it difficult to stand, they claimed she was performing some malevolent magical act. The magistrates took every fit, every scream, as confirmation of Rebecca's guilt. Rebecca's family and friends tried to defend her. 39 residents of Salem village signed a petition testifying to her good character, an extraordinary show of support in a community paralyzed by fear. The petition praised her as a woman of godly conversation and of undeniable good character and expressed their disbelief at the charges against her. But character witnesses meant nothing against spectral evidence and the testimony of the afflicted girls. Please leave a comment below letting us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we love hearing from you. Now, let's return to Rebecca's story. Despite the petition, despite her lifetime of virtue, Rebecca was sent to jail to await trial. The Boston jail where she was held was a nightmare of cold, filth, and despair. She was kept in chains, her elderly body subjected to conditions that would challenge a young, healthy person. Her family visited when they could, bringing food and supplies, but there was little they could do to ease her suffering. On June 29, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was brought to trial before the court of Oir and Terminal. The jury initially returned the verdict of not guilty. This was remarkable, a sign that even in the midst of the hysteria, some people retained their judgment. The jury had apparently been swayed by Rebecca's good character and the lack of credible evidence against her. But then something extraordinary and terrible happened. The afflicted girls immediately began having violent fits. Chief Justice William Stoughton, clearly unhappy with the verdict, asked the jury to reconsider. He pointed to a statement Rebecca had made during the trial, when she referred to another accused woman, Deliverance Hobbs, who had confessed to witchcraft, as one of us. Stoughton suggested this meant Rebecca was admitting to being part of a conspiracy of witches. In reality, Rebecca almost certainly meant that Deliverance was one of the accused, one of the prisoners, someone in the same situation, but Stoughton's interpretation was designed to damn her. The jury retired again to reconsider. When they asked Rebecca to clarify her statement, she didn't respond. She was deaf and didn't hear the question. Her silence was taken as an inability to explain herself, as evidence of guilt. The jury changed its verdict to guilty. Rebecca Nurse was condemned to death. When her family learned of the verdict, they were shattered. This couldn't be happening. Not to Rebecca, not to a woman who had lived her entire life in service to God and community. But it was happening, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. There was one final, brief hope. Governor William Phips, perhaps moved by the petitions and the outcry over Rebecca's conviction, issued a reprieve. For a few days, it seemed she might be saved. But the afflicted girls, their handlers, and the Putnam faction immediately raised an outcry. How dare the governor interfere with the court's judgment? Within days, under intense pressure, Phips withdrew the reprieve. Rebecca would hang. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who served as the minister of Salem Town's church and who was a fervent supporter of the trials, visited Rebecca in jail. He tried one last time to get her to confess, to save her life by admitting to witchcraft. Rebecca refused. She would not lie. She would not confess to a crime she hadn't committed, even if confession meant life and honesty meant death. She had lived her entire life trying to please God, and she wouldn't end it with a lie, no matter the cost. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was taken to Gallows Hill, along with 4 other condemned women, Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin. They were loaded onto a cart and driven through Salem Village and Salem Town, past people they had known their entire lives, past neighbors who now turned away or watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. At Gallows Hill, the execution was carried out with brutal efficiency. The 5 women were forced to climb ladders, leaned against a large oak tree, nooses already around their necks. Reverend Noyes was present, still hoping for last-minute confessions. When the women maintained their innocence, he declared, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." His lack of mercy, his absolute certainty in their guilt, represents the mindset that made the Salem trials possible. The ladders were pulled away. The 5 women dropped, the ropes tightened, and they strangled slowly. There was no mercy, no quick death. They convulsed and struggled as life left them. The crowd watched, some satisfied that justice had been done, others horrified but too afraid to speak out, knowing that defending a condemned witch could make you the next target. After the executions, the bodies were cut down and thrown into a shallow grave in a crevice among the rocks. The executed weren't given Christian burials. They were treated as criminals, as servants of Satan who deserved no dignity in death. But Rebecca's family couldn't accept this final indignity. Under cover of darkness, her sons returned to Gallows Hill, retrieved her body, and buried her secretly on the family property. They couldn't give her a proper funeral, couldn't mark her grave for fear of prosecution, but they could at least ensure she rested on land she had loved, among family. Francis, nurse, Rebecca's husband, was devastated. He had lost his wife of 47 years, his partner, the mother of his children, to a madness he couldn't comprehend. He lived only 2 years after Rebecca's death, dying in 1694, and was buried beside her in the secret grave. Their children and grandchildren carried the stigma of having a convicted witch in the family, though many in the community quietly acknowledged the injustice. Rebecca's story is particularly tragic because it demonstrates that innocence was no defense. She had every advantage a person could have in Salem in 1692. She was elderly, which in Puritan culture should have commanded respect. She was a faithful church member with decades of piety. She had raised a large, respectable family. She had helped countless neighbors through her work as a midwife and healer. She had supporters willing to risk speaking out for her. None of it mattered. The people who condemned Rebecca Nurse weren't monsters, at least not in the conventional sense. They were ordinary people who convinced themselves they were fighting evil. Magistrate John Hathorne genuinely believed he was protecting the community from Satan's influence. The afflicted girls, or at least some of them, may have believed in their own visions. The Putnam family likely convinced themselves that their accusations were righteous. This is what makes Salem so terrifying. Good people, people who believed they were doing God's work, murdered innocent neighbors and felt virtuous doing it. Rebecca's execution didn't end the trials. Between July 19th and September 22nd, 14 more people were hanged. Giles Corey, Rebecca's fellow church member, was pressed to death on September 19th. The madness continued until it finally consumed itself, until the accusations reached so high into society that even the supporters of the trials began to have doubts. In the years after the trials, there were some attempts at redemption. In 1712, more than a decade after Rebecca's death, the Massachusetts colonial legislature reversed the attainder, the legal judgment of guilt against Rebecca and several others. In 1711, the legislature approved compensation for the families of those who had been executed. Rebecca's heirs received £50, a pittance compared to what had been taken from them, but at least an acknowledgement of injustice. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., who had been one of the primary accusers and whose testimony had helped condemn Rebecca, made a public confession. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan, that she had accused innocent people, and she specifically mentioned Rebecca Nurse by name, acknowledging her as a person of so good reputation. It was a hollow apology. Anne was seeking to restore her own reputation so she could become a church member. Her confession didn't bring Rebecca back. It didn't undo the trauma inflicted on the Nurse family, but it was at least an admission of what everyone in Salem knew. Rebecca Nurse had been innocent. The First Church of Salem formally reversed Rebecca's excommunication in 1712, readmitting her to the congregation posthumously. In 1885, nearly 200 years after her death, a memorial was erected in her honor in the Nurse family cemetery. In 1892, on the 200th anniversary of the trials, the Rebecca Nurse homestead was opened to the public as a memorial. Today, visitors can walk through the house where Rebecca lived, see the property she tended, and visit the small graveyard where she and Francis rest. Rebecca Nurse's story endures because it represents the ultimate injustice. A life lived in service to others, in devotion to faith, in kindness and charity, meant nothing when fear and hysteria took hold. Her story reminds us that moral character alone cannot protect us from mob justice, from systems designed to produce convictions rather than truth, from neighbors willing to destroy each other to save themselves or advance their interests. As you drift towards sleep, think about Rebecca Nurse standing before her accusers, an elderly woman who had spent 7 decades trying to live righteously, now condemned for crimes she couldn't have committed. Think about her refusal to confess, her determination to die with integrity intact, even when a simple lie would have saved her life. Think about her family, watching helplessly as their mother was destroyed by a legal system that valued spectral evidence over a lifetime of virtue. Her story is heartbreaking, but there's also something admirable in her steadfastness. She wouldn't compromise her integrity, not even to save her life. In a world gone mad, where everyone around her was lying, confessing to impossible crimes, naming innocent people to save themselves, Rebecca Nurse told the truth. It cost her everything, but she died as she had lived, with honor. And in the end, history remembered her not as a witch, but as a victim, as evidence of Salem's shame, as a reminder of what happens when fear overwhelms justice. Sleep well, knowing that Rebecca's story, tragic as it is, has meaning. It teaches us to question mass hysteria, to demand evidence, to resist the urge to scapegoat others in times of fear. It reminds us that the most dangerous accusation is the one that cannot be disproven, and that systems of justice must protect the innocent even when, especially when, the crowd demands blood. The mystery behind the madness, what really caused the Salem witch trials. For more than 3 centuries, historians, scientists, psychologists, and researchers have puzzled over a fundamental question. What actually happened in Salem in 1692? How did a small Puritan village descend into months of accusations, trials, and executions? Why did young girls have fits and convulsions? Why did a community turn on itself with such ferocity? The answers are complex, controversial, and in some ways still mysterious. Tonight, we'll explore the leading theories that attempt to explain one of America's darkest chapters. The simplest explanation, and the one accepted by the people of Salem at the time, was that the devil was literally at work in their community. To the Puritans, this wasn't superstition or metaphor. They believed in a physical, active devil who could recruit human servants, grant them magical powers, and use them to torment the godly. Cotton Mather, one of the most influential ministers in Massachusetts, wrote extensively about witchcraft and demonic possession. His book, Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, published in 1689, just 3 years before the Salem trials, described in detail how witches operated and how they could be identified. The Puritan worldview was one of cosmic warfare. Every aspect of life was a battleground between God and Satan. Crop failures, disease, accidents, conflicts with Native Americans, all of these could be interpreted as Satan's attacks. In this context, witchcraft wasn't an irrational fear, but a logical explanation for misfortune. If your neighbor argued with you and then your child got sick, and if you believed that Satan could empower people to cause harm through supernatural means, then witchcraft was a reasonable conclusion. But modern historians and scientists, while acknowledging the genuine beliefs of the people involved, have searched for additional explanations. One of the most famous theories was proposed in 1976 by Linda Caparel, a graduate student who suggested that ergot poisoning might have caused the afflicted girl's symptoms. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in warm, damp conditions. When consumed, ergot produces alkaloids similar to LSD. Ergotism, the condition caused by eating ergot-contaminated grain can produce hallucinations, convulsions, a crawling sensation on the skin, vomiting, and bizarre behavior. Caparel noted that 1691 had been a particularly wet year in Salem, creating ideal conditions for ergot growth. She pointed out that rye was a staple crop in the area, and that many of the symptoms described by the afflicted girls matched those of ergot poisoning: convulsions, sensations of being pinched or pricked, hallucinations of spectral shapes, and periods of apparent mania followed by exhaustion. The theory was compelling enough to gain widespread attention and is still mentioned in many accounts of the Salem trials. However, subsequent research has largely discredited the ergot theory. Nicholas Spanos and Jack Gottlieb published a detailed critique in 1976, pointing out numerous problems with the hypothesis. First, ergotism typically affects entire households or communities that share a food supply, not isolated individuals. Yet in Salem, the afflicted girls came from different households and presumably ate different bread. Second, ergot poisoning produces consistent symptoms that don't stop and start on command. The afflicted girls, however, could turn their fits on and off, having violent convulsions when accused witches were present but being perfectly calm at other times. Third, ergot poisoning includes symptoms like gangrene of the extremities that were never reported in Salem. Finally, the outbreak lasted for months and affected new people over time, which doesn't match the pattern of ergot. Another medical theory suggests that the girls were suffering from encephalitis lethargica, a brain inflammation that can cause strange behaviors and movement disorders. This condition, also known as sleeping sickness, appeared in epidemic form in the 1920s and was characterized by bizarre symptoms, including involuntary movements, changes in personality, and altered states of consciousness. However, this theory also has significant problems. Encephalitis lethargica was not documented in the 17th century, and many of the specific symptoms don't match what was reported in Salem. Moreover, like the ergot theory, it doesn't explain why the symptoms appeared and disappeared so conveniently or why they affected specific individuals over an extended period. Some researchers have suggested various forms of psychological disorder. Perhaps the girls were experiencing conversion disorder, a condition where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. In conversion disorder, people can develop paralysis, seizures, or other symptoms without any underlying physical cause. The condition is real, the symptoms are not faked, but they originate from psychological rather than physical problems. This theory has some merit. The afflicted girls lived in an extremely stressful environment. Puritan culture was rigid and demanding, particularly for young women and girls. They were expected to be silent, obedient, constantly vigilant against sin. They lived in a frontier community under threat from Native American raids. Several of the afflicted girls, including Mercy Lewis and Abigail Williams, had witnessed horrific violence during conflicts on the main frontier. They had seen family members killed, had been taken captive, had experienced trauma that would affect anyone profoundly. In this context, fits and convulsions might have been a way to express distress that couldn't be expressed in any other acceptable form. A Puritan girl couldn't complain about her life, couldn't rebel against authority, couldn't express anger or frustration directly. But if she was being tormented by witches, then her suffering was acknowledged. She became the center of attention, and she had a voice, albeit one attributed to demonic influence rather than her own agency. However, the psychological disorder theory also has limitations. While it might explain the initial fits of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, it doesn't explain why so many others joined in, why the accusations spread so systematically, or why specific individuals were targeted. It also doesn't account for the calculated nature of some accusations or the way the trials were manipulated by various factions in Salem village. This brings us to what many historians now consider the most convincing explanation. The Salem witch trials were primarily the result of social, economic, and political tensions that had been building in Salem village for decades, and the accusations of witchcraft became a way to act out these conflicts under the cover of religious righteousness. Salem village in 1692 was a community under enormous stress. It was locked in a bitter dispute with Salem town over governance and resources. The village wanted independence, but Salem town resisted. Within the village itself, there were deep divisions. The western part of the village, closer to the frontier, was dominated by farmers. The eastern part, closer to Salem town, had more merchants and was more prosperous. These two factions disagreed about almost everything, about whether to separate from Salem town, about who should be the minister, about land use, about taxes. The Putnam family led one faction. They were large landowners, but had experienced significant setbacks. The family's wealth was declining relative to others in the community. They had lost land in legal disputes. Several family members had died in recent years. They strongly supported Reverend Samuel Perris and wanted Salem village to be independent from Salem town. They represented the conservative, agricultural, inland faction of the village. Opposing them were families like the nurses, the porters, and others who tended to be more prosperous, more connected to Salem town's merchant economy, and less enthusiastic about Reverend Perris's ministry. These families represented a more progressive, commercial vision for Salem village. When you map the accusations geographically and analyze them by family connection, a striking pattern emerges. Paul Boyer and Stephen Niesenbaum, in their landmark 1974 book, Salem Possessed, demonstrated that accusers and the accused came from opposite sides of these factional disputes. The accusers were predominantly from the Putnam faction and the western part of the village. The accused were predominantly from families allied with the Porters and from the eastern part of the village. This suggests that the witch trials were, at least in part, a way to fight proxy wars over land, power, and the future direction of the community. By accusing their rivals of witchcraft, the Putnam faction could destroy their enemies' reputations, seize their property, and consolidate power, all while claiming to be doing God's work. The genius, if we can call it that, of using witchcraft accusations was that they were nearly impossible to defend against, and they wrapped political and economic conflicts in the mantle of religious warfare. Consider the case of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village who had left after disputes with the Putnam faction over his salary and support. He was living in Maine when he was accused, arrested, brought back to Salem, tried, and executed in August 1692. His real crime wasn't witchcraft, but opposing the Putnams and leaving Salem village. Under contentious circumstances, the witchcraft accusation was a way to settle old scores. Or consider Philip English, one of the wealthiest merchants in Salem town, who was accused along with his wife. English was exactly the type of person the Putnam faction resented: prosperous, connected to merchant networks, allied with Salem town rather than Salem village. The accusations against him were a way to attack the commercial elite that the Putnam faction blamed for their own declining fortunes. But if the trials were driven by factional conflict, what about the afflicted girls? Were they conscious participants in a political conspiracy? The answer is probably complex and varies from individual to individual. Some of the girls, particularly the younger ones, like Betty Paris, may have genuinely believed they were being tormented. Children raised in a culture that taught the reality of witchcraft and demonic possession, living in a frightening world, might well have interpreted their own fears and anxieties as supernatural attacks. Other accusers, particularly some of the older ones, may have been more calculating. Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12 when the trials began, came from the family most invested in the trials. She made more accusations than anyone else, naming 62 people. It's hard to believe she wasn't influenced by her family's agenda, whether consciously or unconsciously. Similarly, Mercy Lewis, who worked as a servant in the Putnam household, had every incentive to please her employers by making accusations that advanced their interests. There's also the simple fact that being an afflicted girl brought unprecedented power and attention. In normal circumstances, these were some of the most powerless people in Salem. Young women and girls with no property, no status, no voice. But as afflicted persons, they were suddenly the center of attention. Magistrates listened to them. Their words could condemn or save people. They were asked their opinions. Their experiences were validated. They mattered. For people who had never had power before, this must have been intoxicating. Moreover, once the accusations began, the girls were trapped in a role they couldn't easily escape. If Ann Putnam Jr. suddenly announced she had made everything up, she would face severe consequences. She might be prosecuted for bearing false witness, a serious crime. She would be disgraced. Her family would be shamed. So the incentive was to continue, to dig deeper into the role, to make more accusations. Each lie required more lies to support it, until the whole structure became too big to abandon. The phenomenon of group dynamics also played a crucial role that we cannot overlook. Once several girls were having fits and making accusations, others joined in, creating a cascade effect. Social psychologists call this behavioral contagion, where behaviors spread through a group, not through deliberate coordination, but through observation and imitation. Each girl who joined the accusers reinforced the legitimacy of the others. If one girl was lying or mistaken, that might be dismissed. But when a dozen girls all reported similar experiences, it became much harder to question their testimony. The group validated itself, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of accusation and belief. The timing of the trials also matters in understanding their intensity. New England in 1692 was recovering from King William's War, a brutal conflict between English colonists and French forces allied with Native American tribes. The war had devastated the main frontier, where several of the afflicted girls had lived before coming to Salem. Refugees flooded into Massachusetts Bay Colony, bringing stories of massacre, captivity, and terror. This created a general atmosphere of anxiety and vulnerability. People felt under attack, threatened by visible enemies on the frontier, and now, they believed, by invisible enemies within their own communities. The war had also disrupted trade, damaged the economy, and created food shortages. When people are hungry, scared, and uncertain about the future, they become more susceptible to explanations that give meaning to their suffering. Witchcraft provided that meaning. It wasn't just bad luck or natural disaster making life difficult. It was Satan working through human agents, and that meant something could be done about it. The accused could be identified, tried, and eliminated, giving people a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic world. The role of Reverend Samuel Parris is also crucial to understanding what happened. Parris was an insecure minister who felt underappreciated and underpaid by his congregation. The witch trials began in his own household with his daughter and niece. Rather than trying to calm the situation, Parris amplified it. He used the trials to consolidate his power, to attack his critics in the congregation, and to prove his importance to the community. His sermons during the trial period were filled with references to Satan's attacks on Salem, positioning himself as a spiritual warrior defending the faithful. Paris's role demonstrates how authority figures can escalate rather than diffuse mass hysteria. If Paris had responded to the initial fits by suggesting natural causes, by calling for calm, by refusing to support spectral evidence, the trials might never have happened. Instead, he validated the accusations, encouraged the girls, and helped create the interpretive framework that turned village conflicts into evidence of demonic conspiracy. The role of the legal system was equally important. The court of Oya and Termina, established specifically to handle the witchcraft cases, abandoned normal legal standards. It accepted spectral evidence, despite many legal authorities arguing this was inappropriate. It allowed the testimony of confessed witches, even though confessed criminals were normally barred from testifying. It created an environment where conviction was almost inevitable once someone was accused. Chief Justice William Stoughton was particularly zealous. He pushed juries to convict, as he did in Rebecca Nurse's case. He allowed the most questionable evidence. He showed no mercy to the accused. His certainty that he was fighting Satan made him willing to abandon legal protections that might have saved innocent lives. When the trials finally ended and criticism mounted, Stoughton never admitted error. He defended the trials to his death, absolutely convinced that he had been fighting evil. So what really caused the Salem witch trials? The answer is all of these factors working together. There were probably some girls who genuinely believed they were being tormented, their beliefs shaped by their culture, their trauma, and perhaps some psychological distress. There were others who were consciously or unconsciously serving their families' political and economic interests. There were authority figures who amplified and exploited the accusations for their own purposes. There was a legal system that abandoned normal standards in the conviction that it was fighting an extraordinary evil. And undergirding everything were deep social, economic, and political tensions that made the community ready to tear itself apart. The mystery of Salem isn't really about what caused the initial fits. It's about how a community allowed those fits to escalate into mass murder. It's about how normal people convinced themselves that killing their neighbors was righteous. It's about how fear, combined with political conflict, religious certainty, and legal legitimacy, created conditions where the unthinkable became routine. Understanding Salem requires us to think about how communities make decisions under stress, how isolated suspicion can turn to accusation and accusation to execution, how authority figures can fail in their duty to protect the innocent, and how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil while believing they're doing good. These aren't just historical questions. They're questions about human nature, about social dynamics, about the fragility of justice and reason when fear takes hold. As you drift towards sleep, consider the complexity of what happened in Salem. There's no single villain, no simple explanation. There are patterns of human behavior, social pressures, cultural beliefs, and individual choices, all interacting in ways that produced tragedy. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize similar dynamics in our own time, similar ways that communities can turn on themselves, similar dangers when we're too certain of our righteousness, too willing to accept flimsy evidence, too ready to believe the worst about those we fear or resent. The mystery of Salem has been solved, not with a single answer, but with a recognition of how many factors contributed to the disaster. And that understanding is perhaps more valuable than any simple explanation could be, because it teaches us to be vigilant, to question our certainties, to demand evidence, to resist the urge to scapegoat, and to remember that the monsters are usually not supernatural but human, not external but within our communities and ourselves. Life among colonial Boston's elite, wealth, power, and privilege in Puritan Massachusetts, while the farmers and common folk of Salem Village tore each other apart with accusations of witchcraft. Life in Boston and among the colonial elite was dramatically different. Tonight, we explore the world of wealth and privilege in late 17th century Massachusetts. A world of imported luxuries, political power, and social prestige that existed alongside, yet utterly removed from, the suffering of ordinary colonists. This is the story of how the other half lived, the merchants, magistrates, and ministers who controlled Massachusetts Bay Colony. Boston in 1692 was the undisputed capital of New England, a thriving port city of approximately 7,000 people. It was the largest and most prosperous settlement in British North America north of the Chesapeake. Unlike Salem Village, which was an agricultural community struggling with subsistence farming and frontier threats, Boston was cosmopolitan, connected to global trade networks, and growing wealthier by the year. The contrast between Boston and Salem Village was stark, almost as if they existed in different worlds rather than just 20 miles apart. The elite families of Boston occupied a social stratum that most colonists could never hope to reach. These were the merchants who controlled the lucrative Atlantic trade, the magistrates who administered colonial law, the ministers who led the most prestigious congregations, and the large landowners who had accumulated property through decades of careful acquisition and advantageous marriages. Families like the Winthrops, descendants of John Winthrop, who had served as governor, the Dudleys, the Sewalls, the Mathers, these names dominated colonial politics and society. At the top of this hierarchy were the great merchants, men who had made fortunes in trade. They imported manufactured goods from England, fine textiles, metalwork, ceramics, glassware, and exported colonial products like fish, timber, and furs. They invested in shipping, owning vessels that sailed to England, the Caribbean, and the Wine Islands. They extended credit to smaller merchants and farmers, becoming creditors to much of the colony. Their wealth was substantial, measured in thousands of pounds rather than the tens or hundreds that represented the entire net worth of a Salem Village farmer. Consider the home of a wealthy Boston merchant in 1692. It would be built of brick or substantial timber frame construction, 2 or even 3 stories tall, with multiple chimneys, glass windows with leaded panes, and perhaps carved decorative elements on the exterior. This alone set it apart from the simple wooden structures most colonists inhabited. Inside, the differences became even more pronounced. The entry hall would feature wainscoting, wooden paneling that covered the lower walls, and perhaps a wooden staircase with turned balusters, rather than the simple ladder that led to sleeping lofts in common houses. The rooms would be plastered and painted, not just bare wood. The floors might be covered with imported carpets, though these were expensive enough that even wealthy families often used them as table coverings rather than floor coverings, reserving them for display and special occasions. The furnishings would include pieces that a Salem Village farmer would never see. Upholstered chairs with cushions covered in leather or fabric, tables made of expensive imported woods like mahogany, cabinets for displaying ceramics and silver, looking glasses with ornate frames, clocks that actually kept accurate time. The walls might display oil paintings, maps, or prints imported from Europe. There would be books, many books, leather-bound volumes that represented substantial investments. A well-furnished Boston merchant's home might contain 50 or even 100 books, a library that would be the envy of most English country gentlemen. The dining experience in such a household bore little resemblance to the simple meals of Salem Village. While a farmer ate from wooden trenchers or pewter plates, using a wooden spoon and perhaps a knife, wealthy Bostonians dined with imported ceramics, Delftware from Holland, or China from the Far East. They had full sets of silverware, forks as well as spoons and knives. They drank from glass vessels or silver cups rather than leather or wooden mugs. They owned napkins, tablecloths of linen, salt cellars, and specialized serving pieces. The food itself was richer and more varied. While Salem village farmers subsisted mainly on corn, beans, and squash, supplemented by whatever meat they could produce or hunt, Boston merchants ate imported delicacies. Sugar from the Caribbean, a luxury so expensive that it was kept locked away. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves that cost more per pound than a laborer might earn in a week. Wine, brandy, and rum rather than just cider or beer. Dried fruits, almonds, and other imported treats. Refined wheat flour for white bread, while common folk ate dark bread made from rye or corn. A formal dinner at a wealthy Boston home might include multiple courses. A first course of soup or stew, a second course featuring roasted meats, perhaps venison, beef, or pork, accompanied by vegetables and sauces. A third course might offer pies, both savory and sweet tarts, custards, and preserved fruits. The table would be set with care, demonstrating the host's wealth and taste through the quality and abundance of both food and tableware. Clothing was another marker of elite status. Puritan values emphasized modesty and discouraged ostentation, but there was considerable latitude in how these principles were interpreted. Wealthy Bostonians wore garments made from fine imported fabrics, broadcloth from England, silks, velvets for special occasions, linen shirts with lace or embroidered details. Their clothing was tailored, fitted to their bodies rather than simply cut from a pattern. They owned multiple outfits, changing clothes regularly rather than wearing the same garments day after day. Men of the elite class wore knee breeches, stockings, shirts, waistcoats, and coats, all carefully coordinated. They owned wigs, or at least had their hair styled fashionably. They carried silver-buckled shoes, walking sticks, and perhaps pocket watches, status symbols that announced their wealth. Women wore gowns with fitted bodices and full skirts, made from fine fabrics and colors beyond the simple browns and grays available from home dyeing. They owned jewelry, perhaps gold rings, silver brooches, or pearl necklaces. They had accessories like fans, gloves, and fancy aprons that served more decorative than practical purposes. The education available to elite children was far superior to what most colonists could access. Boston had established the first public school in North America, Boston Latin School. In 1635, the sons of wealthy families attended this school or were tutored privately, learning Latin, Greek, mathematics, rhetoric, and classical literature. They might go on to Harvard College, founded in 1636, where they studied theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. This education prepared them for careers in ministry, law, or medicine, or simply marked them as educated gentlemen capable of leadership. Daughters of elite families also received education, though of a different sort. They learned to read and write, to cipher enough mathematics to manage a household, to speak some French perhaps. They were taught needlework, music, dancing, and the social graces necessary to be proper wives to men of their class. The goal was not professional training but cultivation, creating women who could manage complex households, entertain appropriately, and raise children who would maintain the family's status. The social calendar of Boston's elite bore little resemblance to the relentless labor that characterized life in Salem village. Yes, merchants worked, managing their affairs, corresponding with business partners, overseeing their investments. But they also had leisure time, time for social visits, for dining with peers, for intellectual pursuits. Ministers like Cotton Mather spent hours in their libraries, writing treatises on theology, natural philosophy, and colonial affairs. Magistrates like Samuel Sewall kept detailed diaries that reveal lives filled with social engagements, family visits, and community events alongside their official duties. Religious observance among the elite maintained the same outward forms as among common folk. Church attendance, prayer, Sabbath observance, but the experience was different. Elite families had their own pews in church, purchased seats near the front where they were visible to the congregation. These pews might have cushions, providing some comfort during long services. The ministers who served Boston's churches were the most educated, most sophisticated preachers in the colony. Their sermons were intellectually rigorous, filled with classical allusions and theological subtleties that would have been lost on a less educated audience. The servants and enslaved people who worked in elite households formed an invisible foundation for this comfortable lifestyle. A wealthy merchant family might employ half a dozen servants or more, a cook, maids for cleaning and laundry, a manservant who might serve as a combination butler and personal assistant, perhaps a groom to care for horses and maintain the stable. Some families also owned enslaved Africans or Native Americans, people who had no hope of freedom, who worked without wages, whose children would inherit their enslaved status. These household workers made the elite lifestyle possible. They rose before dawn to light fires, prepare breakfast, clean chamber pots, haul water for washing and cooking. They scrubbed floors, beat carpets, polished silver, laundered and mended clothing, prepared elaborate meals, served at table, and cleaned up afterward. They worked from before sunrise until after the family retired for the evening, usually sleeping in unheated attic rooms or in the kitchen near the dying fire. Their labor was essential but largely invisible, noticed only when something went wrong or wasn't done to satisfaction. The relationship between masters and servants was supposed to be paternalistic, with masters responsible for the spiritual and physical welfare of their household dependents. In practice, this could mean anything from genuine care and concern to harsh exploitation. Servants could be beaten for disobedience or poor work. They had little recourse if mistreated, as the law and social custom heavily favored masters. For enslaved people, the situation was even worse. They were property with no legal rights, subject to their owner's absolute authority. Yet this system of household service also created complicated relationships. Servants lived intimately with the families they served, eating their food, hearing their conversations, observing their private moments. They knew their master's secrets, their weaknesses, their fears. A trusted servant might have considerable informal influence, managing the household, advising on purchases, even offering opinions on family matters. But this intimacy existed within a rigid hierarchy where the servant always remained subordinate, always vulnerable to dismissal or punishment. The Mather family exemplifies the pinnacle of elite status in colonial Massachusetts. Increase Mather served as minister of Boston's Second Church and as president of Harvard College. His son, Cotton Mather, was one of the most prolific writers in colonial America, producing more than 400 works on topics ranging from theology to medicine to natural history. The Mathers moved in the highest circles of colonial society. They corresponded with intellectuals in England and Europe. They advised governors and magistrates. They lived in comfortable homes filled with books and surrounded by respectful congregants and students. Yet even the Mathers were deeply involved in the Salem witch trials, demonstrating how closely connected all levels of Massachusetts society were, despite the vast disparities in wealth and status. Cotton Mather attended the execution of George Burroughs, the minister accused of witchcraft, and afterward wrote defending the trials. Increase Mather eventually published cases of conscience concerning evil spirits, which questioned spectral evidence, but only after 19 people had already been hanged. The elite could observe the trials, write about them, influence their course, but they were largely insulated from the terror that gripped Salem village. This insulation came from both geography and status. Boston was 20 miles from Salem village, far enough that the immediate panic didn't spread there with the same intensity. More importantly, the elite had resources that common folk lacked. If accused, a wealthy merchant could hire the best legal representation, could call upon influential friends to intervene, could flee if necessary and weather the financial consequences. When Philip English, one of Salem's wealthiest merchants, was accused along with his wife, they escaped from prison and fled to New York, remaining there until the trials ended. They had the resources and connections to manage this. A poor farmer had no such options. The legal system itself was dominated by the elite. Magistrates and judges came from prominent families. They were educated, property-owning men who shared the same social circles as the merchants and ministers. When making decisions, they were conscious of social hierarchies and the need to maintain order, which often meant protecting the interests of their own class. This doesn't mean they were deliberately corrupt. Most genuinely believed they were serving justice and the common good, but their perspective was inevitably shaped by their position in society. The political power concentrated in Boston was immense. The General Court, the colonial legislature, met in Boston. The governor, appointed by the Crown after the old charter was revoked in 1684, resided there. Colonial policy was made in Boston by men who might have little direct experience with frontier life or agricultural struggles. Their concerns were often different from those of rural colonists, maintaining trade relationships, negotiating with the Crown, managing relationships with other colonies, defending Boston's preeminence in New England. This concentration of power created resentment. Salem village's struggles to separate from Salem town were partly about local control, about not being governed by distant authorities who didn't understand or care about village concerns. The Putnam faction in Salem village, despite being relatively prosperous by village standards, was still marginal compared to Boston merchants. Their resentment of the commercial elite, their sense that traditional agricultural values were being displaced by merchant capitalism, fueled some of the dynamics that led to the witch trials. Yet despite these tensions, the system remained stable because the elite controlled the key institutions, the courts, the legislature, the prominent churches, the militia officer corps, the major economic enterprises. They also maintained their position through strategic marriages, forming alliances between prominent families that consolidated wealth and power. A Winthrop might marry a Dudley, a Sewell might marry into the whole family, creating networks of kinship that reinforced social hierarchies. The homes of the elite also served as centers of patronage and influence. A wealthy merchant might employ dozens of people directly: servants, apprentices, clerks, ship captains, and crew. He might extend credit to hundreds more, creating relationships of dependence and obligation. When he spoke in the general court or offered an opinion on public matters, he spoke with the weight of all these relationships behind him. His influence extended far beyond his individual vote or voice. The cultural life available to Boston's elite far exceeded anything in rural areas. Boston had a print shop that published books, pamphlets, and eventually the first newspaper in the colonies. Elite Bostonians could purchase the latest works from England, read treatises on theology, philosophy, and natural science, engage with ideas circulating in the Atlantic world. They formed literary and philosophical clubs where they discussed these ideas, debated interpretations of scripture, and considered questions of governance and society. This intellectual engagement gave the elite a sense of sophistication and refinement that distinguished them from common colonists. They saw themselves not just as wealthier, but as more cultivated, more rational, more capable of leadership. This self-perception justified their monopoly on power. If they were more educated, more exposed to learning, more capable of complex thought, then naturally they should make decisions for society. This circular reasoning, their advantages proving their superiority which justified maintaining their advantages, sustained the social order. The medical care available to elite families was also superior, though 17th century medicine was primitive by modern standards. Wealthy families could afford to consult physicians, university-educated men who commanded high fees. These doctors practiced a medicine based on ancient theories about bodily humors and might prescribe remedies that ranged from helpful to actively harmful. But at least elite families had access to professional care, to imported medicines, to someone with formal training. Common folk relied on folk remedies, midwives, and hope, consulting a doctor only in the most desperate circumstances, if at all. Life among the elite wasn't entirely without challenges. Disease struck wealthy families as well as poor, and 17th century medicine could do little for most ailments. Childbirth remained dangerous for women of all classes. Elite families worried about their children's spiritual state, about whether they would be among God's elect or damned to hell. They felt pressure to maintain their status, to manage their wealth wisely, to ensure their children made appropriate marriages. But these concerns, real as they were, played out against a background of material comfort and security that most colonists could only dream of. The legacy of this elite class shaped Massachusetts and eventually American society in profound ways. They established institutions, Harvard, Boston, Latin School, congregational churches, town meeting government, that would endure for centuries. They created a model of merchant capitalism that would drive American economic development. They produced leaders who would play crucial roles in the American Revolution and the founding of the United States. Names like Adams, Hancock, and Quincy, prominent in revolutionary Boston, descended from these colonial merchant families. But they also established patterns of inequality, systems where wealth and power concentrated in a few hands while the majority struggled. The same society that produced Harvard and sophisticated theological debates also produced the Salem witch trials, where the powerless were sacrificed to settle the scores and assuage the fears of their betters. The elite could write learned treatises about witchcraft, while ordinary people were hanged based on spectral evidence. They could debate the finer points of Puritan theology in comfortable libraries, while farmers struggled to survive harsh winters and hostile frontiers. As you drift into sleep, consider this final contrast. On July 19, 1692, as Rebecca, nurse, and 4 other women were hanged on Gallows Hill, life in Boston continued largely unchanged. Merchants conducted business, ships arrived and departed, wealthy families dined on imported delicacies and discussed theology. The trials were news, certainly a topic of conversation, but they didn't disrupt the comfortable rhythms of elite life. This distance, this insulation of privilege from suffering, is perhaps the most telling aspect of colonial society. The world of colonial Boston's elite reminds us that societies have always been stratified, that wealth and power have always provided buffers against the hardships that afflict common people. It also reminds us that those who control institutions, who write the laws and interpret them, who command resources and respect, shape society in ways that reflect their interests and perspectives. The Salem witch trials happened in part because the elite allowed them to happen, because the legal system they controlled accepted evidence and procedures that made conviction almost certain, because they were slow to intervene until the accusations started reaching their own ranks. Understanding this world of privilege helps us understand the complete picture of colonial Massachusetts, a society of stark contrasts where geography, wealth, and status created vastly different life experiences. The struggles of Salem village farmers and the comfort of Boston merchants existed in the same political entity, under the same government, within the same religious tradition, yet they might as well have been different worlds. And when crisis came, when the witch trials erupted, those contrasts became even more apparent, revealing the fault lines that ran through colonial society. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.